All right, well, welcome everybody. My name is Ankur Shukla and I am the moderator for this event. So this event is a part of the Braver Angels DC Alliance Solutions Exchange. So let me tell you a little bit about what the Solutions Exchange is. So people know about Braver Angels as one of the leading organizations for reducing political polarizations at the grassroots. The Solutions Exchange and the DC Alliance is meant to highlight solutions to polarization at scale. You know, right now with Braver Angels, we do a lot of, and across the polarization spectrum, we do a lot of dialogue, bring 10, 20 people into a room, have them discuss with each other on political issues, and see if we can reduce polarization that way. But really, you know, you bring 10, 20 people into a room at a time and get them to talk to each other. On scale, in a country of 330 million people, that would take hundreds of years to really reduce polarization. So what are some scalable methods for reducing polarization? This Solutions Exchange, which is a series of panel discussions on various topics, has hosted a number of ideas: arts and polarization, social media and polarization, K through 12 education and polarization. And today we're going to look at electoral reforms, ranked choice voting, and polarization, and how ranked choice voting can be an instrument for reducing polarization. So we have an esteemed panel here from the nonprofit sector, from the left, from the right, all of whom are going to talk about what ranked choice voting is, why it is helpful in various contexts, where it has been shown to work, and what impact it has had on polarization, and why we think it's a solution to this problem. So we've got two different audiences joining today. We've got people joining in from the Braver Angels crowd, and we've got people joining in from the ranked choice voting crowd, because this event has been broadly advertised in both of those communities. So I'm going to set the stage for both of those communities today to talk a little bit about why polarization matters, and then also what ranked choice voting is. So for the audience members who are from the ranked choice voting side, who are new to polarization, let me just point out some statistics. So this is from the Listen First Project, which is the leading organization in the political polarization space. Their data shows that 87% of Americans are tired of political division. 87% of Americans say political polarization is a threat to America. 86% of Americans say they feel exhausted by the division in America. 81% are concerned about political divisions within the country. 80% of partisans believe that the other party poses a threat that, if not stopped, will destroy America as we know it. 77% of Biden-Trump voters believe that Americans who strongly support the other side are a clear and present danger to America. Voters identified political polarization as their second highest perceived threat to democracy. 72% of Republicans view Democrats as more immoral than other Americans, while 62% of Democrats say Republicans are more immoral than other Americans. And I've seen figures of how, Listen First also has figures about how a small majority of Americans literally believe that a civil war could be on the horizon, and that, you know, violence is justified to win their political perspectives. So now that we have a stage of what political polarization is and why it matters to the country, let's talk about ranked choice voting. So my position is that I'm the organizing director for Maryland for Rank the Vote and ranked choice voting for Maryland. So my day job is to go out into the community and educate Marylanders about ranked choice voting and the impact that it can have. And I'll describe ranked choice voting to you the way I describe it at fairs and farmers markets and gun shows and town squares. You know, I go up to a voter and say, hey, have you heard about ranked choice voting? Ranked choice voting, right now, when you go to vote, you have one vote. You know, you've got 2 options, 10 options, you only get to vote once. And if that person doesn't win, well, that's it. That's all. That's the only opportunity you had. With ranked choice voting, you know, if there's 10 people in the race, as often does happen in crowded primaries, you get to rank your candidates, 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. And let's say if your first choice candidate is last place, and nobody gets the majority of the vote, your vote automatically goes to your second choice. And then that keeps happening. The last place candidate keeps getting eliminated, and voters' preferences keep going to their second, third preferences until somebody gets a full majority of the vote, at least 51% of the vote. And that method leads to a broad consensus audience, a candidate, somebody who truly has at least a majority of voter support. And the way it's designed, because a candidate has to say, look, if you don't vote for me as your first choice, please at least vote for me as your second choice. They engage in less mudslinging of the other candidates because they don't want to tick off those candidates' voters. They engage in more issues-based campaigning, which of course helps to reduce polarization. But today I'm going to leave it to my panelists to talk a little bit more detail about how polarization and ranked choice voting are linked. But it is what we believe is an important tool for reducing political polarization at a scalable level. So I'm going to introduce our esteemed panel today. To my left is Ryan Suto. He's a senior policy advisor at FairVote. He has written on political polarization and ranked choice voting. You know, the one thing I learned about him that I find most impressive about you, Ryan, is that he's also a first generation college student. So he comes from a family that has just a very impressive background. I definitely connected to you as a person whose family couldn't afford to go to college, send him to college. I connected to you right away. Then we've got Matt Germer from the conservative think tank R Street. Matt has written extensively on why ranked choice voting is an important reform for conservatives. You know, there is within the conservative audience a lot of skepticism. Matt wrote about how, you know, the conservative group ALEC held a conference and they literally passed out keychains that said "Stop RCV." Is that, am I quoting this?
The hotel key cards were branded by the Stop RCV lobby, and yet most of the folks in the room had no idea what RCV was, but that was their takeaway.
Yeah, so. And Matt has written about why RCV is actually good for conservatives, so we'll hear from him. Rebecca is from the Center for American Progress. I learned just recently that she is also in my alumni network from the Harvard Kennedy School. She's also got a star-studded resume from Stanford and Brown that I won't go into, but she's a very accomplished lawyer, and we're very happy to have her on this stage. So I am going to. I've got a set of questions. The way this panel is designed is we're going to go down the list with the candidates. We're trying to build up a case for ranked choice voting and polarization. So we're going to go to the panelists one at a time and get their perspectives. First, you know, what is ranked choice voting and why? And you know, do voters understand it? Why is ranked choice voting good for conservatives? And then a case study about how ranked choice voting is actually working on the ground. So I'm going to start with Ryan. So Ryan, I explained briefly what ranked choice voting is, the way I would explain it to a grassroots voter on the ground. Can you tell me a little bit, what else would you like to add to that description? And can you tell me about, is ranked choice voting complicated for voters to understand? I mean, in Maryland, ranked choice voting was on the ballot in Rockville, but the city council took it off because they felt that voters didn't understand it. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is ranked choice voting really difficult for voters to understand, and what does the data show?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the earlier explanation and the introduction. So first of all, in general, voter education, regardless of your voting system, regardless of your population, is really important. So events like these are really great, and I'm happy to be here. Ranked choice voting is the fastest growing election form in the country. It's catching fire everywhere. So if you want to be one of the cool kids, hop on board. It's really easily understood by voters. We put out polls in fields where voters actually use it. For example, in New York City, 95% of voters said it's easy. In Alaska, 85% said it was simple. In Minneapolis, 92% said it was simple. So these are, diverse cities, both between each other, but also internally in terms of socioeconomics and regions. And all of these voters say it's really simple and really easy. On the front end, we've heard apprehension, like as you mentioned in Rockville, but as soon as voters get it in their hand and they see the ballot, we rank all the time, every day. Hey, I'm going to the store. I want turkey, but if you can't find turkey, get roast beef or something else. We do these things every day. So the actual process for voters is easy, is simple, across demographics and regions.
Absolutely. And when we go into the grassroots, when I go into the grassroots with my organizers, my volunteers, we take a little card with us that has like superhero rankings. Spider-Man, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman. Who's your favorite superhero? Rank them 1, 2, 3, and then we show that. Oh, okay. Superman got the lowest votes, and nobody got a majority. Superman's eliminated. Your vote automatically goes to Wonder Woman or whoever your second choice candidate was. We use ice cream as rankings. We use beer ranking events to get the message across. The reality is that people rank things all the time, whether it's the grocery store, whether it's anything that they deal with their life, and it's not really that much different.
Yeah, and as we're coming to the presidential primary, there are a lot of times you'll have a favorite candidate, they drop out before the primary gets to your state. And so we often, even in politics, implicitly rank, oh, now that blah, blah, dropped out, who's going to vote for next? Ranked choice voting is the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me go back to my questions. So Ryan, can you talk a little bit about our current system, which is known as the first past the post system? First of all, what is it, and how does voting in this way increase polarization, and how could ranked choice voting help?
Yeah, so under our current system of voting, we all, I assume, know how we vote currently. It's just whoever gets the most first choice votes wins. And if you had a crowded field, or if you have a hyper kind of active minority group that are super excited about this, maybe a donor base, it's someone with a small percentage of support can end up winning, especially if you have a crowded primary and that person is pushed along in an uncompetitive gerrymandered district, which a huge percentage of our House districts are gerrymandered and not really competitive in the general election. That can really take a divisive candidate who might really only be liked by 20 or 30% of the district and put them all the way through the general election. And so we've seen this time and time again in state capitals across the country and in Congress. If anyone's been watching the speaker circus, it's been a prime example of extreme elements in the body politic being able to kind of take over. And ranked choice voting would eliminate a lot of the kind of flame-throwing incentives that we see. If you know that you might not get a first choice from a certain community, let's say just a community that historically doesn't vote for your type of politics, you might be able to be their second choice. And so you're less likely to kind of flame throw against their preferred candidate or their community as a whole. And so, we see as it elevates people who actually want to do the serious job of government, as opposed to people who, want to kind of alienate 60% of their district because they know they only need that 40% to get past the primary, to get to the general.
You have the numbers of, I think I read on one of your articles or another FairVote article that 6 of the 8 Republicans who overthrew Speaker McCarthy only won with a plurality of their votes.
Yes.
in their primaries. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, exactly. So, so these are highly, kind of gerrymandered districts. These are safe seats. This happens, both sides of the aisle across the country, right? There'll be the safe seats where everyone knows only only a Republican's gonna win this district. And so you go into the primary and you only need, especially if it's a crowded primary, you might only need 20% of basically the Republican voters who show up on primary day. I mean, this could be such a small slice of the district writ large. And as we said, the majority of those who able to use, unseat Speaker McCarthy were from those kinds of districts. Their incentives were misaligned. They weren't aligned to a general kind of consensus governing. They were aligned toward pleasing a kind of extremist base that was, through our current system, given more power than the numbers were due.
And how would ranked choice voting help the situation?
Yeah, so ranked choice voting, first of all, someone with such a small base in a primary, they wouldn't move forward. I mean, once you have the voting, if someone doesn't get 50%, as you mentioned, they would go to the second round, and they would eventually drop out to someone who has much more broader support among the party. And then in a general election, again, candidates would need to have a broader support in order to actually win.
Is there any data to show that ranked choice voting could tackle affective polarization, the polarization where Americans from across the aisle literally hate each other, characterize each other as a threat to democracy, wish that people on the other side were dead and the country would be better off?
Sure.
Is there any data that shows that?
So we definitely have data that shows that politicians who go through the ranked choice voting system are much more bipartisan. If you look at Alaska, their state legislature is much more bipartisan. It's one of the most bipartisan in the country. Maine, the congressional, their delegation that they send to Congress is elected from ranked choice voting. If you look at Susan Collins or Jared Golden, they're some of the most bipartisan members of Congress. And so if you're creating incentives to work with the other side, it's going to be harder, and you're less likely to demonize them. You're less likely to be the type of person that is willing to demonize them if you are needing to go to them to actually govern.
So where do you see the opportunities for implementing ranked choice voting around the country, and what are some of the barriers?
Yeah, I mean, the opportunities are anywhere there's a meeting like this across the country, there's an opportunity to really bring ranked choice voting to cities and towns and states across the country. I mean, there are over 20 cities in Utah. I mean, Utah's very different than what you mentioned. New York City is the largest city that's ever used ranked choice voting in the United States. So those are completely different kind of political atmospheres, and it works in both places, right? There are Oregon is working toward ranked choice voting, Minnesota, Vermont, etc. Virginia used ranked choice voting in their governor primary, and Glenn Youngkin was one of the few statewide Republicans that have won in Virginia in a long time. So we see the opportunities of being almost anywhere. And the challenge is really just, some Americans and some people in general have a little bit of a reticence of change. I think that's natural in a lot of humans of, oh, it's different, right? And that's really, I think, the biggest stumbling block. Also, as we like to say, where I, did my poli-sci degree, turkeys don't vote for Thanksgiving, right? So if you're an elected official and you've got your fun little gerrymandered district and you have your 30% of voters that you only really need to care about, doing something new might make your job harder in that sense of keeping the job.
Sure.
And so there is some kind of institutional reticence for adopting.
And maybe we can come back to this question of like, how do we get over the institutional barriers to adopting? But I want to take this to Matt, because we're hitting on the topic of barriers, and Matt, you've written a little bit about, the barriers within the conservative movement.
Yeah.
And how conservatives are skeptical of ranked choice voting. Now, I talked to you a little bit about this, before the panel, and I'm gonna present this as something to the audience. I canvass, in liberal parts of Maryland, I canvass in conservative parts of Maryland, and I do notice that there's, some reticence in more conservative areas towards ranked choice voting because of, what they may have heard in the media, but I still sign people up. I went to a gun and knife show, a couple weekends ago, and I signed up 20 people, 20 supporters of ranked choice voting. So it's not as if, conservatives writ large are against ranked choice voting. If you talk to them and explain to them, hey, look, this is gonna empower the grassroots, they listen to you and they sign up at kind of about the same rate as what you would get in a more liberal audience in terms of like the number of signups per hour. It's not that, it's actually, it is actually doable. There is more hostility because, people hear negative things in the media, so if they know about ranked choice voting, often they've heard the negative, but it is possible. What I want to discuss with you is, you've written about why ranked choice voting is a better system of voting for conservatives. Tell me a little bit about that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so thank you, and thank you for having me here. Once again, Matt Germer, I'm a fellow at the R Street Institute and the associate director of the governance program there. I spend quite a bit of my time looking at ranked choice voting and other forms of alternative voting systems. Ranked choice voting being the most popular and prolific across the country, which to me presents a lot of promise. When I talk to folks about the issue, one thing that really sticks out is that ranked choice voting is a style of an election. It's a way of voting, it's a tool. It doesn't have a particular outcome in mind. It is not a plot. It is not, that's something that's being driven by one side to create a particular policy outcome. It's designed to create an outcome that is reflective of the jurisdiction that is electing someone. And so if you plop ranked choice voting into a very conservative district, you will get a very conservative representative coming out of that district. Where real value comes in is that the ranked choice voting creates an incentive, changes the incentive structures around why candidates will behave the way that they do, whether it's as candidates running for office or once they are elected and how they govern. There is an incentive to reach out beyond your base. I think for a lot of Republicans, they'll hear that and think, wow, this is how you end up with squishy moderates. But in reality, it's how you end up with people who have a more moderate disposition and not necessarily more moderate ideology. You can have a steadfast conservative who's willing to sit down and do the hard job of governing with someone that they disagree with, because that person can then go back to their district and show what they have done to what might be a king-making minority of voters in that district. You have a district, for example, that's 60-40, I'll use Republican in this case, 60-40 Republican in a traditional partisan primary, first past the post election. Once the Republican wins the primary, that race is done. In races like they use in Alaska, where you've got 4 people who move on out of the primary election, you could have multiple Republicans on that general election ballot, and in fact, you often do. The 40% of Democrats function as kingmakers. The Republicans don't then run as Democrat lights. They could try, but they will lose the big chunk of that 60% of Republicans. It'd be very difficult then to ultimately win the election. What they need to do is present themselves as Republicans who aren't scary to Democrats. This gets back to your point around polarization. Instead of it being, I'm defining myself in opposition to something else, it's I'm defining myself with a positive agenda for what I'm for, and I'm going to try to convince the other side that even if we don't ultimately see eye to eye, that I can do my best to represent some portion of their interests, to reach out. When I talk to Republicans about this, depending on kind of where they fall within the Republican spectrum, I think a lot of people are interested in that. I think a lot of people are really frustrated when they look at polarization in our country. We looked at those numbers, you mentioned those numbers of people who are just exhausted. There's a lot of Republicans in that group. I'm one of them who I think about our current state of politics and I just want to be done. Can we fast forward to whatever comes next? Because I have to imagine that whatever comes next can't be as exhausting as the present. So for a good chunk of Republicans, I think just describing what ranked choice voting does and why it can be really meaningful. There's also still a portion of Republicans who are, they're partisans. And they identify as I am a Republican, and therefore I want Republicans to win, and that's their motivating factor. I think for talking to them, it gets back to the idea that ranked choice voting is a tool. Much like a knife could be used to stab someone, it can also be used, as a scalpel in a surgery to save someone. Tools don't have a bias as far as what kind of outcome they're necessarily preferring. It depends on the context and how they're used. In this case, ranked choice voting is most effective, in my view, in races where you've got multiple candidates that voters would be interested in. That's often nonpartisan races or primaries. And I think in the primary context, there's the most opportunity for Republicans, and that's where there's been the most traction. Because the real argument, you can point to Glenn Youngkin being the classic example of a guy who came out of what was a very contentious primary. And Amanda Chase was threatening to pull out of the Republican primary process entirely, run as some sort of third party, function as a spoiler. Ranked choice voting kept her campaign in the race. They thought they might have a chance at getting through this, but ultimately Youngkin's team came out, and he represented the most electable of the Republicans in that primary, and he won. And I think for describing to that kind of partisan interested base of Republicans, explaining that it's a tool that can help you identify your best candidate in the primary, who can then win in the general, is a persuasive argument. Now, to be fair, I present this to Republicans, but regardless of your own personal political persuasion, there's a similar benefit on the other side of the aisle. If you want your ideology to be enacted, you need as many people who agree with you to win their general elections to do that. Republicans, I think, are going through a bit of an identity crisis. So this argument, I think, has a little bit more of a persuasive impact at the moment, but it's true on both sides. And for a couple of those other classic examples, you can imagine a world in which a couple of very key Senate races this last time around had candidates that did not excite a number of Republicans, who either then chose to stay home or just skip that election on their ballot, or perhaps even cross party lines and vote for the Democrat. Whether it's Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Republicans would have been, Republicans likely would have been in the majority in the Senate if they didn't run candidates that were unelectable. Ranked choice voting in the context of like a final four, final five, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about what's going on in Alaska. If voters had another candidate on the ballot in the general that they think represents their partisan interests, but it wasn't as personally flawed, the outcomes might have been different. And once again, to Republicans, I think it's a persuasive argument. Ranked choice voting is a tool, and the real question is, how are you going to use it?
So can you talk about what are some of the roadblocks for conservatives endorsing ranked choice voting?
Yeah, happy to. So I think when I think of that question, there are really two groups. You kind of have your grassroots and grass tops, or in the context of grass tops, I'll refer to that as like Republican elected officials. I think looking at them first, there's the same incentive structure that exists as referred to before. If you are currently a Republican elected official, you don't really want to change the rules that got you your job. You're probably doing pretty well with that at the moment. And so it is in your incentive then to speak poorly of reforms, regardless of what they are, whether it's ranked choice voting or primary reforms or redistricting reforms. Any of these kinds of changes threaten your current base of power. So I think there is a certain amount of difficulty on both sides, but particularly within the Republican Party at the moment, of folks who don't want to threaten their own status. From the grassroots level, I think there's a couple things at play. One, even with your success at gun shows, that doesn't surprise me, but there is a certain element of like the conservative disposition that is skeptical of change, that wants change to come and to come slowly, if it does at all. I think to Chesterton's fence, the parable of Chesterton's fence from G.K. Chesterton talks about two people walking in a field, and that a foolish person sees a fence that they don't know what it is and just says, let's tear it down and get rid of it. And that the prudent person says, well, first let's find out why they built the fence, and then we can tear it down if it's appropriate. I think there's a certain amount of the conservative disposition that says, hold on, this new reform is something I haven't heard of before. I'm going to be against it until I can be convinced that I need to be for it. But there's also a strain within the American right that is just anti-establishment generally. And I think for that crowd, there's really a lot of interesting promise around ranked choice voting. Back to that first point I was bringing up, for elected officials, they like status quo. For folks frustrated at the status quo, ranked choice voting provides an opportunity for them. The other major roadblock gets to that group I mentioned before around partisan Republicans. who want to see their side win. Ranked choice voting at a national level, where it's made national news, has often happened in circumstances where there was a seat that was perceived as being a Republican seat that when ranked choice voting was implemented, flipped to the Democrats. It's either the 2nd congressional district in Maine was really the kind of first major national example where Jared Golden won the race. Republicans held that seat. The election occurred with ranked choice voting. The Republican was in first place with the most first round votes, but not 50%. And when the left-leaning third-party candidate was eliminated, that candidate's votes largely transferred to the Democrat. The Democrats won the seat. Republicans probably fell. Already bad taste in their mouth because they wanted to win. Enter Alaska, and in particular, a very key congressional race occurring off the regular cycle as a special election to replace Don Young. And it involved a major national figure, Sarah Palin, as one of the Republican candidates against Mary Peltola and oh goodness, what's his name? Nick Begich, who is a Alaskan, part of like an Alaskan legacy family, who's had multiple his uncles and father who represent the state of Alaska. And that race was high profile. It got national attention. I think a lot of Republicans in the lower 48 look at Alaska and think it's a ruby red state. How could they possibly elect a Democrat? I think that there's some truth to that, but when you start to scratch the surface a bit, you realize that Alaska is largely like a pro-choice state. Some of the regular ideological overlaps we expect aren't there. There's a reason why Murkowski keeps winning. There's also the element of Sarah Palin just wasn't a popular candidate. She had substantial disapproval ratings in the state. Mary Peltola, meanwhile, ran as a moderate Democrat. She ran as a friend of the oil industry, as a friend of the fishing industry, wanting to maintain like the use of natural resources in Alaska, with some reasonable caveats on that. But she ran as a moderate Democrat and reached out to Republican and moderate leaning voters. I wasn't surprised she won. Well, I guess I was slightly surprised that Palin ended up getting more votes than Begich. I think if he had the most Republican votes, the outcome might have truly been different. But Begich voters didn't want to vote for Palin. They picked him very specifically and explicitly left Palin off there as their second choice. So once again, in a special election, and then again in the next general election a couple months later, Republicans nationwide saw a seat they thought they were entitled to, and they lost. And so with those kind of pieces combined of like, I'm not so sure about change, and I want to win, and I'm watching this take place, and I'm not winning, I think it's giving folks the impression that ranked choice voting has a partisan tilt to it. And really what it is finding the candidates that best fit the districts. In Maine's 2nd congressional district, Jared Golden is a better fit for the people there. And I say that as someone who probably disagrees with him on a variety of things, but like I can admit that he represents his district. And Mary Peltola represented the people of Alaska more broadly in the way that she ran than Sarah Palin did.
So, but of course, for the voter on the ground, watching Fox News or watching any sort of conservative media, seeing a Republican lose in perceived ruby red states is not the way to sell ranked choice voting. Even if the person that won has the broad consensus. So ranked choice voting is doing what it's supposed to do, but in the first out the gate system, it's put up an example that might not be so palatable.
But ranked choice voting could have saved Republicans in a variety of these other contexts, whether it was the Senate races in Georgia and Pennsylvania and Arizona and elsewhere. You can point to Glenn Youngkin's success using ranked choice voting in the primary process in Virginia, that ultimately then catapulting him to a successful general election. I think some part of this is just the way that our news ecosystem works at the moment, is that people tend to focus on what they're mad at. And when things go well, they're not always digging for the why. They just expect the good news. They don't ask why. When the bad news comes, they want to know what happened. And then on top of that, I think there is a known push among Republican grass tops against ranked choice voting. There's a pretty active campaign targeting Republicans to turn them against it before they really even know what it is, which gets to what you referenced before. We through an event at ALEC at their summer conference, which if you're not familiar with ALEC is a conservative organization of state lawmakers largely, that pushes them kind of toward a free market, low tax, low regulation outcome. They don't really do a lot of elections work. That's not their bread and butter. But the members who come really represent a smattering of state lawmakers on the right. And as we hosted this event,
huge chunk of them were predisposed against ranked choice voting, and not because they knew a lot about it, they had heard a lot about it. And as we walked them through much of what I've explained to you, how it can be a functional tool, how it's been used to the effect of the party to win, depending on the context in which you're using it, we leave the meeting and multiple state lawmakers come forward to us and say, I'm far more interested in this now. No one explained it like this. I didn't realize that it could be used in a primary, for example, instead of it being used in the way that Maine or Alaska uses it. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I guess the last thing I'll say on this is, I think a lot of Republican states already use runoffs. And I think most people don't realize that. We kind of know Georgia. That's like this now national story folks are used to with runoffs. You might be familiar with Louisiana and the structure that they use, where if no candidate receives 50%, they go on to like a top 2 runoff situation. But a lot of southern states in particular use runoffs in the primary. And they're expensive and no one shows up. It's already a primary election. Now it's a primary runoff. The electorate is tiny, and yet the county still has to administer a full election. There's a real taxpayer benefit to an instant runoff election using ranked choice voting in those primary contexts, because they've already tacitly admitted that they think 50% is an important threshold for winning a primary in Texas and Alabama and a number of other states. This is really just a good government change at that point, because now instead of wasting taxpayer money on a follow-up primary runoff, just get it done and go.
Now I want to move on to Rebecca, because we've talked a lot about Alaska, and I want to hear a little bit about Alaska. What's happening there? What happened? And what does it show us? What does it show us about polarization in that state? What were the successes of RCV? What can we learn from Alaska?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for inviting me here and having me here. Again, my name is Rebecca Mears. I am director of the democracy team at Center for American Progress. So as Ankur noted, I'm here to talk about Alaska. So I'll start with sort of a federal level and then go into the state, which is really interesting. So at the federal level, as Matt noted, there are people who were very upset by the outcome, but didn't realize what was actually going on in the ground. TOA actually ran a very positive campaign and explicitly cross-endorsed with Senator Murkowski to get their second choice votes. And they even made a commitment to vote for one another across the aisle. Now this gets neglected when it gets blown up at the very national level and becomes a big flip, a big story, but it neglects that aspect of it. The other thing to note is that that wasn't the only statewide election that happened. You saw at the House a centrist Democrat win, but in the Senate, you also saw Murkowski win again, a moderate Republican, and you also had a gubernatorial candidate, and you saw a very traditional conservative Republican. This is all at the same time, at the same election, all statewide. So as Matt noted, it's a tool, and where you use it, you're gonna appoint and adopt and elect the candidate you think is truly best for the job and the one that truly represents the electorate. Now, going back into sort of the state level, which doesn't get as much focus, it's where I've been doing a lot of my research. And I've talked to a few of the state legislators who were elected under this system. Alaska has what is known as top 4 or final 4. It's not just ranked choice voting. It's actually an open primary at the primary level, and the top 4 move on to the general, and at the general, they do ranked choice voting among them. So I spoke with the Senate Majority Leader, who is a Republican of the Alaska State House, Kathy Giesel. She's a very interesting story where she had been in the Alaska Senate for years and very much billed herself as a consensus-driven Republican who sat and worked across the aisle. Now, this angered a few people on the party who really wanted a more right-of-center, traditional, conservative Republican, so they primaried her, and she lost. When she lost, she heard a lot from Democrats in her district, independents in her district, saying, I'm so shocked, I'm so surprised, you were great, we didn't agree with everything you said, but we agreed with a lot of what you did. You governed for us, you listened to us. So here comes the electoral reform. Kathy Giesel runs again. This time, she wins. The shocking thing, she actually had about the same first choice votes as her more Republican candidate, but the second choice votes, when the Democrat in the race had been eliminated, she took almost all of it. She had a huge uprising, huge majority of that. And she notes that this is a big part of the electoral reform. Instead of just going to a traditional knocking on the doors of Republican voters and asking them for their vote, she knocked on doors of everyone in her district. She tells a story of she knocked on a door of a Democrat who recognized her because she had served in the state house for a while. And he said, excuse me, you must have got the wrong house, the wrong door. I'm not for you. And she explained, no, I am. Like, I am running to represent this district. I'm not just representing, 60%, 40%, what have you, of the electorate who identifies with one party. I'm representing the district. I care about you. I want to, do this. I'm consensus driven. Will you vote for me? And turns out she did get a lot of those votes. But this is not just, one person. We actually see this across different parties. So there's a Democrat in the state house, Zach Fields, who similarly from the Democratic side had the same story of being just very consensus driven, of speaking to people across the aisle and saying, look what I've done, look at my record, look how I've actually sat down and governed, and vote for me. And they did. And again, it doesn't even just stop there. The minority leader of the Alaska State House is an independent, and he ran under the system, and he had a very similar response. So it's really about giving voters their ability to vote for the people who are actually governing for them, actually producing results and going across the aisle. And when we talk about depolarization, I think you're seeing it in these campaigns. You're seeing a more positive light, a more willingness to actually knock on doors of people who might not traditionally have, seen as important to your vote, but now you care about them, you're governing for them, you're really trying to reach across the aisle. And so there's some great stuff coming out of there. Even the leadership in the state house is now a bipartisan, cross-partisan structure, and they've been getting a lot done, and they've only had 1 year under this new system. So there's more to come in the future, but it is very promising. And the last point I'll note is just, Ryan already beat me to it on the statistic that when you ask voters in Alaska about ranked choice voting, 85% of them noted that it was simple. And on top of that, they found that 66% actually did rank multiple candidates. So they did use this system. They did rank first choice, second choice, and go on from there.
So I guess the message I'm carrying away from what you said is that candidates really do try to listen to everybody. They don't try to listen to their extreme bloc or just the people that are really going to be gung-ho activists. They go across and say, no, look, you may be from the other party, but I'm running to represent you. And if I don't get your first place vote because I'm a Republican, you're a Democrat, let me get your second place vote because I'm still going to represent you, and this is how.
Absolutely. And voters are understanding this, voters are using this, and candidates are understanding this and using this. And we're seeing this actually result in the people who are elected are the ones who are bothering to go across the aisle and really make this kind of consensus-driven policy their primary factor.
Listen, I could have questions for this panel for a while. I could definitely have a number of questions, but I think we're getting to the point of the event where we're going to open up the questions to the audience. So we've got a number of people in the room, and I understand we've got some people on Zoom as well. And I believe we're going to be going back and forth between questions from virtual questions as well as in-person questions. So I'll just go. I'll call on the person. I think there's a person with their hand up. I can't see. Greg, what is your question?
Sorry, it took me a second to unmute. So one of my key questions is, I think I'm very much in favor of ranked choice voting. Here in Washington, it's really not going to do much unless we have open primaries where Republicans and libertarians or centrists can also vote. But the other thing that I would appreciate some input on is, one of the selling points is that it can tear down barriers. We talk about our government being highly influenced by big money, contributors to campaigns. Any indications as to whether it will help in that respect as well?
Let's take that question.
So I'm happy to. Thought I'd count to three and see if someone else wants to speak. So I'll get to your second part first about its impact on, or big money's impact and the role that ranked choice voting can play. I think ranked choice voting again is a tool, and I think if you combine it with a few other reforms, it can be incredibly powerful. And again, I'll keep pointing back to Alaska because I'm just so excited about what they're doing. I think the combination of substantial primary reform with ranked choice voting and the fact that they kind of limit it to 4 people, so you're not asking folks to rank like 15 options, which can feel overwhelming, is a great balance. From the big money question, there's something to be said that, you know, the candidates who have money will make it easier for their name ID to be out there. Will make it easier to campaign. Money is the fuel for campaigns. In a closed primary election with a small electorate in a gerrymandered district where once you've won that primary, you've won the seat, it doesn't take more than a handful of key donors really to push someone over the top. Like if they want to muscle out regular voters or regular donors, they can fairly easily because you just basically need to buy enough votes to win in that closed partisan primary. I think big money it won't solve every problem related to the incentives that campaign donations create. But it does shift the ultimate decision of like, who are the deciders of who's going to win the race? It shifts that from the primary, in this case of like the Alaska system, shifts it from primary to the general. And I think by doing that and increasing the size of the electorate, increasing just the coverage of the race, the amount of people who are paying attention to what's going on and who are clued in, could reduce the impact that special interest money could potentially play, because now you've got you have a lot more voters you'd have to buy to persuade folks to do that. And I guess that gets to really your first part of the question, which was around how, you know, whether we need to be coupled with primary reform. I think that it does to be at its most effective in a general. I look at a state like Maine, which uses ranked choice voting in a general election without any really meaningful primary reform on that front. You end up with like a Republican, a Democrat, and maybe a couple of third parties. For the most part, it's not that powerful of a tool because voters walk in and they say, I am a Democrat, I am a Republican. At best, what it does is it empowers third party voters, which is great, but that's also such a small slice of the electorate. It's not at its maximal use. Using ranked choice voting in a system like Alaska eliminates so much of the problems that you're reflecting around. Like the election that matters is one in which only some segment of the voters are allowed to participate. If you've got a wide open primary system where all of the candidates, regardless of party, appear on the same primary ballot, then all voters get to participate. And kind of getting back to my question about how I talk to Republicans about this, taxpayers pay for these elections. They should have a right to participate in the elections that matter in the region that they live. That is a fundamental like taxpayer service. It's why we have elections, and it's a good government service. The combination of these reforms ensures that happens.
Thank you very much.
For state and federal legislature elections, doesn't having larger multi-representative districts combined with RCV make a big difference, especially for gerrymander?
I think Ryan's been on this.
Yeah. So FairVote, one of our big legislative proposals is what we call the Fair Representation Act, and it actually does just that. It would increase, instead of everyone having 1 member of Congress, you might have 3 members of Congress or 5 members of Congress, and each district would have those multi-members, and then you would use ranked choice voting to select them. That really increases the political diversity that we would see in any kind of legislature, political, racial, ethnic diversity. For example, you know, Massachusetts, they only send Democrats to the House of Representatives. We all know that there are Republicans in Massachusetts, right? Mitt Romney used to be one of them. But they get no votes, right? You use multi-member districts, you use ranked choice voting, and Massachusetts will send Massachusetts Republicans to the House of Representatives. And the same thing with Oklahoma Democrats, for example. And right now, we don't have those voices in Congress. Those people just don't, when they look at Congress, they don't see themselves reflected. So at the federal legislature, that's one of the things that we push really strongly, and then, we think it would be a great reform.
We've got the next question from Zoom, John D. John D, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'd like to ask the panel to talk about the difference in polarization as it relates to approval voting versus ranked choice voting. And in particular, I prefer ranked choice voting to approval voting because I like to be able to specify my first choice, second choice, third choice, rather than just who I'm willing to accept. But I think that I've heard some people allege that approval voting creates less polarization or more popular candidates making it through the process. And I'm wondering if you have any insights on whether that's, I don't know the details behind that, whether there's any truth to that, and just how they compare with regard to, especially with regard to polarization.
So probably the first part of that answer is defining approval voting for folks who may not be familiar with that system. Approval voting, there comes in a variety of forms. In fact, there's even a combination of ranking and approval I'll get to in a moment. But approval voting at its core is basically mark an X next to any candidate you'd be okay with winning. So instead of having a ranking, it's just do they meet a minimum threshold for you to be satisfied? Whoever ends up with the most X's wins. It's very effective in a variety of contexts. I think it gets used. I've seen it used really well in like corporate environments when you're picking between options for like, what does the team want for lunch? We'll pick any style of food you'd be okay with. And to the extent that it can be useful in politics, I mean, I'm open to it. I know that there are some folks in the electoral reform world where it gets real hostile between the approval crowd and ranked choice voting crowd, even though I think at its core, everyone that's part of either one of those crowds prefers it to the status quo. The other version of approval I think worth mentioning is what's often talked about as star voting, which is a little bit of a combination of approval and ranked choice. You get to rank your candidates, give them a certain amount of points, basically. Like, this is my 5-point candidate, my 4-point total of the points, see who wins. Kind of combining the combination of approval and ranked choice. Again, fascinating. I think either one of them is a good step forward in the context of polarization. For all I care, these whole structures are in place to change the incentives that are in place when candidates run for office, why they behave the way that they do. Any structural change that encourages candidates to represent their district more fully, to reach out to people who otherwise disagree with them, and around the polarization point, to not define their political experience by rabble-rousing among the most committed voters in their base, and like where their entire electoral strategy is, I'm going to turn out the base in the highest numbers that I can. That strategy is effective in our current system, but it's unhealthy. And it really just encourages politicians to define themselves by what they're not, instead of what they're for. And I'm optimistic for what approval can provide. It's not nearly as popular as ranked choice voting. It's not in use in as many places. I think there are some efforts in North Dakota that have, at the local level, that have tried to use it. I've seen some initiatives or similar things in, I think, Missouri or St. Louis has started to look at it. It's not anywhere near as tested as ranked choice voting has been. But again, this is the laboratories of democracy, and if there are places that want to give it a shot, I'm all for something that helps to shift incentives.
Rebecca, Ryan, do you have thoughts on approval voting and star voting?
I do not, but my opinion is very similar to Matt's, actually. Look at that, you have a right leaning and a left leaning, and we're sharing an opinion, which is really, it's about changing the incentives of who's running. And beyond that, really ensuring that this is what the locality, what the jurisdiction wants. I'm very loath to come in and prescribe a one-size-fits-all model. I'm a big proponent of, if you're going to have government of, by, and for the people, that there should be some input in the system that you're going to be using. So if localities want to experiment this, try this, I'm all for it. And I agree that as long as we're getting past the first past the post system, then I'm interested in looking into it.
Yeah, I'll only add that, especially when you're doing coalitional advocacy work, it's always good to play nice in a sandbox. And so I won't cast aspersions on any particular system or movement. But as mentioned before, ranked choice voting is the fastest growing and most popular. We think that it's because it's really much more intuitive. You know, very seldom have I walked into a voting booth and thought, you know, these 3 or 4 candidates are equally acceptable, right? I definitely have the first choice and the second choice. And I think ranked choice voting is intuitive and that allows you to express that those rankings and also have the benefits of that consensus that we've been discussing about.
I also think it was very ironic that John D, when you referenced both approval and ranked choice voting, you then ranked your decisions for approval and ranked choice voting. So, you know, there we go. It's intuitive.
See, but I'd approve of either, right? I mean, either one's better than the status quo.
Yes.
I came in, I think, you know, for ranked choice voting and feel, you know, even stronger hearing all of you articulate the reasons for it. But I'm just kind of curious, you know, if you were to pick maybe one intellectual argument for, you know, being opposed to it, right? And maybe thinking of the status quo, you know, can you think of one and what would be your counter argument to that? And if you can't, then that's a fine answer too. And I do want to exclude like, okay, somebody just doesn't want change or somebody who got elected and doesn't want change for that reason.
Keep going first, but I'm always happy to go first. I think from a like political science intellectual style argument, first past the post is just very flawed. And it's very difficult to make strong arguments on its behalf from like a theoretical perspective. Okay. But I think its strongest argument on its behalf is practical. American voters are used to first past the post. We have a crisis at the moment of confidence in elections. Too few voters trust the outcome. And there's a meaningful argument that parts of America just are not ready for this, and it would foment further distrust because it's a change. It's a change in a time when they're already skeptical about the way things are being handled. And to me, I think that's something that advocates of ranked choice voting need to walk in on, you know, open with their eyes open. You got to find the right context. You got to find the right circumstances if you're looking for this reform, and be patient with folks because they don't spend I spend all day, every day thinking about elections, and it motivates me. That's why I wake up in the morning and go to work. But for most people, they don't think about elections but once every 4 years. And they're frustrated by other things. And so it takes a lot of patience to kind of overcome the practical side of that, which I mean, it's a good argument to that end. It's not a theoretical one, but yeah.
I think we're.
Yeah, close to it. I just wanted to make a little announcement by then. So, hello everyone. I'm James Cohen, one of the co-chairs of the DC Alliance. I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Ankur and Ryan and Matt and Rebecca for an excellent panel. The announcement I want to make is that we have a lot of events, and so I hope to see many or all of you again. We have a couple more solutions exchange events before the end of the year. We have a couple of workshops. We have an event on the 29th about faith and polarization. And, you know, given the tragedies among Israelis and Palestinians right now, we actually have a Jewish and Muslim leader who will talk at the beginning of that panel. If you're interested in any of these or our holiday party at my house in December, check that out. So we have these sheets on both tables with a QR code, and you can see the calendar that we have of our events and hopefully register for more. So thank you very much.
Thank you to our panel. Thank you for making the time. This has been a wonderful discussion. We've had a good audience listen to this, and we're going to put this up on YouTube, and you know, we'll be spreading the message in different ways. I've already discussed with the panelists a little bit about how we're going to use this to kind of spread awareness about ranked choice voting and polarization and whatnot. So this has been a very helpful discussion, and we will take it beyond this room as well. So thank you everybody for coming. I suppose if you have questions for the panelists, are you guys open to sticking around and taking some more questions? So please feel free to come up and ask them. If you have any questions about grassroots organizing, that's my bailiwick.